Turning now to the examples for risk of loss, we're going to do example 1 and example 2, where we're just going to show the difference between void and voidable title. Dan and his painting. Among several valuable paintings in his collection, Dan is the proud owner of a beautiful portrait called Young Man with a Horn. One day he discovers the painting missing. It turns out it has been stolen by one Earl. Earl sold it to Felice, who had no reason to question how it came into Earl's possession. Felice in turn sold it to Gail. Gail happens to show her new acquisition to her friend Dan, who recognizes it as the piece missing from his collection. So the first question we have is, other than Dan's friendship, does Gail stand in jeopardy of losing anything else? That is, can Dan recover the painting from her? So can Dan recover the painting? Dan can get the painting back from Gail. In fact, he can get it back from anyone who has it, whenever and wherever he finds it. So in this example, we have a chain of possession involving theft. Earl obviously never had title. He didn't take by anything that the UCC or any other rule of law would see as creating an interest in that painting. When Earl sells it to Felice, she cannot and does not get title. Because Felice does not have title, Gail can get none by her purchase. It is that's as straightforward as it is, and as a practical matter, we don't have to worry about how Dan goes about getting actual possession. Once he proves it's his painting, that it's been stolen, there shouldn't be any difficulty. Actually, his right isn't found in the code. I may have mentioned this in the slides, but it's a classic property action we're going to talk about when we talk about property. It's called replevin. It's to recover one's property wrongfully held by another. So notice again that this is in spite of our assumption that neither Gail nor Felice had any bad motive or any reason to know that they were dealing with quote-unquote hot property. So you might think the result given here is hard on Gail, who will be left with nothing of value and out of the amount she paid to Felice. The answer, as we will see, is that she'll be able to sue Felice for her damages, and then Felice will have the right to go against Earl for her damages. To be sure, the right to go against the thief might not be all that conforming, because people like Earl will probably disappear and you won't see him again. So Felice may be left holding the bag, right? But again, this may not seem terribly fair to Felice, but remember, what about Dan? Remember that the alternative to this would be to conclude that Dan, whose property was stolen, could not recover it. What would we say about him, right? I guess Dan could go after Earl. But Dan was at a loss right at the beginning. The title was void. Earl didn't have any title rights or interest in the property to be able to transfer. So any subsequent transfer of property that was not initially given title is not going to be valid. That's like the example from the lecture with regards to the watch and Ben and the watch. So next example. Number 2, suppose that Earl did not actually steal the painting. Instead, he arranges to buy it from Dan at a very hefty but perfectly reasonable price. Earl picks up the painting, giving Dan in exchange a personal check for the entire purchase price, and then the check bounces. Dan tries to get in touch with Earl, but the rascal's disappeared. When he later sees the painting in Gail's possession, will Dan be able to legally get it back? Is this different? This is the case of the bounced check. Seems pretty similar to what we just saw, but actually it's quite different. In this case, Gail has good title in the painting. How could this be, you might ask? Earl's behavior is perhaps a little less monstrous, but why should that make a difference? The answer is found in the concept of voidable title and its consequences as laid out as we discussed. A person with voidable title has the power to transfer a good title to a good faith purchaser for value. So the painting was delivered in exchange. Of course, we have 4 instances where this voidable title comes in, right? The painting was delivered in exchange for a check that was later dishonored. Remember that language? Because this is so, Earl himself did not gain title. He did not have the right to sell what wasn't properly his to sell. What he did get was the power to transfer a good title to Felice, provided that she was a good faith purchaser, as the definition is in the code. We'll assume that in this situation she is such person, whatever that term means. So upon purchase, Felice has good title, which means Felice sells it to Gail, who thereby gets good title. So the obvious question is why the outcome of this problem should be so different. Actually, it's the opposite as the prior one. It's about the justification, right? It is at least arguable that someone who buys from a thief should have been able to avoid doing so by using a little more care and circumspection. We do not say that the same is here, right? Where someone allows a thief to get at the property. But here, Dan did not take all the precautions he could have to avoid losing the painting to Earl this way. He took a personal check. In the real world, that's got to be understood as taking a big risk, because personal checks can and sometimes do bounce. So if Dan wanted to protect himself, he could have asked for cash, certified check, something of the sort. So it's also very possible in this situation that Dan allowed Earl to get his hands on this kind of documentation of ownership. So here it falls to Dan, right? And relative to the next component of this, so the answer is he's not going to be able to get the painting back from Gail, because Gail has good title. So would it make any difference to your analysis if Dan could show that the only reason he took a personal check from Earl was that Dan thought him to be another person, also named Earl, who was known to be one of the wealthiest and most upstanding people in the community? No, the same argument is the same as above. Dan's going to suffer the consequences of not protecting himself more successfully against that kind of behavior. That mistake falls on him. All right. And the final component of this, suppose that instead of taking a check, Dan insisted on cash on delivery. At the time of the sale, Earl picked up the rather bulky canvas and then said he was taking it out to his car to stow safely in a trunk. He said he'd be right back with the cash. Earl, of course, disappears. Now what? Is that different? That's not going to be any different either. What if Felice knows how Earl came about to get the painting? Does that make things different? Yes, that would make things different if Felice knows, because now she's not a good faith purchaser for value. So when she obtained it, she didn't obtain good title, so that means she can't transfer it to Gail. So that's how example 1 plays itself out. Example 2, Rick and his guitar. Rick has a rare and expensive electric guitar which he values highly. The story is that it had once been played by Elvis, but it's on the blink and he takes it in for repair to Kathy's Music City. It's a retail store selling various musical instruments, which also has a service department. When he goes to pick it up, an embarrassed Kathy tells him that one of her clerks mistakenly sold it to Chris. Can Rick just go to Chris's house and insist that he gets the guitar back? What more do you need to know to advise Rick? That should be no, not now. What do you need to know now? What do you need to know to advise Rick? All right. So if Rick is having trouble recovering this guitar, it's going to be because of the entrustment rule. Remember that one? The merchant. Clearly, Kathy did not get title from Rick, nor is there any way for Chris to argue that Kathy had obtained voidable title. It doesn't fit that definition of the voidable title. But any entrusting of possession of goods to a merchant who deals in goods of the kind gives him power to transfer all rights to the entrustor to a buyer in the ordinary course of business. Remember that definition? Since Rick presumably had all the rights of a title holder, if this section applies to the situation, Chris now has good title. So Rick could not get the guitar back from Chris and would only have an action against Kathy for what she did. But let's look at some questions here. Okay, we know that Rick did actually entrust the goods to Kathy. That seems pretty clear. The fact that he delivered the car to her only for the limited purposes of repair is not going to make any difference. But let's talk about Kathy. Kathy seems clearly to be a merchant, right? But is she a merchant who deals in goods of this kind? She runs a retail store which sells musical instruments, but would every such mom and pop store deal in rare memorabilia like this piece? Does Kathy's Music City normally deal in such precious objects? Presumably the question should be addressed from the point of view of the person doing the entrusting of the goods. Was there a reason for Rick to realize that leaving the guitar in Kathy's possession put him at risk, that just this kind of thing could happen, and that he could lose title this way? And then finally, we have the question of whether or not Chris qualifies as a buyer in the ordinary course of business from Kathy. And, such a person's kind of like the good faith purchaser for value. It's very important to distinguish in the commercial law. They're not identical. The buyer in the ordinary course of business, he must be buying in good faith and without knowledge that the sale violates the rights of another person in the goods. So Chris could not have title to the goods if Chris were somehow acting in bad faith, or if Chris had reason to know that the guitar was Rick's and he wasn't interested in giving it up. So beyond that, the purchase must be from a person in the business of selling goods of that kind. So again, we come to the question of whether Kathy deals in goods of this kind, which is the special kind of memorabilia that the guitar is. But here from more of a buyer's perspective. So was there any reason for Chris to doubt that the retail store would normally sell this item? That's going to be a question you're going to have to ask. The types of things you might need to know more of before answering the questions. But it looks as though the entrustment rule applies here, and that Rick just can't go to Chris's house and insist that he get the guitar back, but rather Rick might have an action against Kathy and her music store. So that's the answer to number 2. The other examples on the sheet we're going to go over and refer to in the next section.